Well, good morning and welcome to today's second panel of the Houston Global Freight Summit, presented by Baker Institute Center for Energy Studies and Port Houston. Today's second panel examines the global supply chain and hopefully will offer answers to the questions: what is needed to make it resilient and effective, and what new technologies are on the horizon. We have three great panelists with very different perspectives this morning. Before I get started, I'm going to steal a little bit of their thunder, because when we talk about making the supply chain, the freight network, resilient and effective, I'll repeat, we've had some incidents here lately. The pandemic, we've had the Suez Canal blockage. We've had the Colonial Pipeline incident. And I know Steve Flynn's probably going to want to talk a little bit about that. So I will introduce the three panelists and all at one time, and then we'll call on them in order. First is Stephen Flynn, who's the founding director of the Global Resilience Institute at Northeastern University in Boston. Now, for those of you that don't know, he's also, I guess we can give him credit for creating what's called the Global Resilience Research Network, which brings people together all over the world to look at this whole question of resilience. I'm privileged to be his colleague as one of the fellows there at the Global Resilience Institute, and they are really on the cutting edge of resilience, not just supply chain, but all types of resilience. But today we've asked Steve to focus on supply chain and global freight. Second panelist is Charles Thompson, Chief Information Officer for Port Houston. When you talk about resilience and effectiveness and what new technology is coming, somebody like Mr. Thompson is right in the forefront. If you looked at ports 30 years ago, you wouldn't have predicted that they'd look the way they do now. And my guess is 30 years from now, the change will just be continuing. And our third speaker, who may not be able to be seen because it's terrible to have technological difficulty when you're on a panel about technology, but Curtis Spencer hasn't been able to show his face yet, but he is on audio. But Curtis is the president of Ims Worldwide Inc. And if you don't know what Ims Worldwide Inc. is, it started mainly focusing on foreign trade zones, but it's expanded beyond that. And Curtis is now pretty much seen as a visionary in the freight industry. He's one of those guys that he'll say something, you go, nah, that can't possibly be true. And then a few years later, it turns out to be true. So with these three panelists, I think we're going to have a fascinating time. I can tell you the time's going to go quickly. It certainly did with our first panel this morning. So the first question, and we'll go in that order with Stephen Flynn, Charles Thompson, and Curtis Spencer. I'd like you to share your thoughts about the short-term and long-term impacts of the pandemic, and more importantly, suggest one or two improvements that are needed to make the global supply chain resilient. So, Steve Flynn, lead us off.
Well, thanks so much, Judge. It's a real honor to be a part of this conversation. And my professional origins are as a Coast Guard officer, and I spent 20 years on active duty and a good bit of time in the Port of Houston over the years. And so it's thrilled to be connected this way, and obviously a great honor to have you as one of our distinguished senior fellows at the Global Resilience Institute at Northeastern University as we ponder how do we make the world more resilient. The focus here, the conversation around the supply chain, really speaks to my roots with dealing with a lot of these issues. And I think if there's a single takeaway from the COVID-19 pandemic, it is that it's not that necessarily that we live in a world where there are more hazards than there's ever been before. Disease outbreaks have always happened throughout, the course of history. But it is that we are hyper-connected. And so what used to be a local disruption now cascades far more rapidly and far more disruptively than it ever did in the past. And so we moved from an outbreak in Wuhan, China in January, and within about 6 to 8 weeks, we're shutting down the global transportation system with all the cascading effects, right? The source of that is not necessarily the virus, but it is the ability for the virus to essentially move because we're so closely connected. And the solutions for dealing with this risk was largely about societies initially just trying to throw a kill switch to stop everything, to freeze, in order to try to get their arms around the nature of the risk as well as, what could we do about it. So we shut down aviation. We started talking about closing borders. We started, of course, as contagion happened, as the frequency of it spread, we had people stay home. We operating remotely. So all those responses were largely because there were so few options that were really available for dealing with the pandemic outbreak in terms of how people thought about the risk in advance. And that's really one of the core elements of investing time and effort in building a resilient enterprise and ultimately trying to build a more resilient society, is to think through, and often scenarios are very helpful for this. What if this plays out? What's our plan? How are we going to cope? As human beings, we're marvelous at denial. We're really great at essentially making our minds go away from problems that seem wicked or too hard. And often it's just taking a complicated problem, even one like a pandemic outbreak. It's like sitting down to do a jigsaw puzzle. On its first, you should throw your hands up usually. But what you start doing usually is picking up pieces, looking for where there's some commonality, starting to put them together, and over time, you actually get to the proverbial bigger picture. It's not seamless. There are all those silver lines as a part of the puzzle. But thinking and being willing to think about through disruption and how to cope with it is something that the global freight industry does every day from a tactical standpoint, because no day is perfect. The truck never arrives entirely on time, and on it goes. And so there's great rewards for nimbleness at the tactical level. But the real risk, and again, COVID really highlights this for us, is at the systems level. That as localized decisions are taken, often good rational decisions, they in fact can have unintended consequences that can lead to system-wide failure. And happy to tease out those a little bit more as we go forward, but I'll stop there.
Okay. Mr. Thompson.
Judges, it's a pleasure to be with you today. I'm going to share the two technology things that have happened during the pandemic. First thing is you're muted, unmute, and everyone says, "Can you hear me?" So I'm assuming both those things are true, that you can hear me.
We can hear you.
And we welcome everyone. It's interesting. I tell the story of the pandemic, and in technology, we talk about digital transformation. When I joined the port 6 years ago, proud to be a Port of Houston employee, we were using paper at the docks to be able to do ship-to-shore transactions. And now we don't do that anymore. The pandemic forced us to accelerate our movement of some of our projects to gain greater efficiencies and resiliency. I talk about my son asking me, "Well, I still have fresh fruit in my lunch every day?" And I said, "As long as I work at the port, you will," because the systems that drive the transactions that allow us to move cargo efficiently and effectively throughout the port, in and out of the terminals, is something I take pride in. And I will close with two things and then pass on to the next presenter. Cybersecurity and information security are not separate entities, as we saw from the first slide in the deck. There's going to be a greater responsibility because it's not about trying to stop an incident. It's about being able to mitigate the risk and respond to the incident. The second thing is, and I'll be happy to tease this out as my colleague said, imagine technology that allows you to pick up 6 seconds on every transaction and allowing the Port of Houston to take those 6 seconds and turn it into 12 to 16 hours of more productivity. Those are the things we're investing in, and those are the things that I will continue to investigate. Be happy to talk about it. Judge, back to you.
Okay, good. Thank you. Curtis, I don't think we can see you, but hopefully we can hear you.
Yes, sir, Judge, and I really appreciate it. Can you guys hear me okay?
I can.
All right. Thank you for having me, and this is probably the most important session I think I've been a part of with you, Judge, and that is because the incidents, like Stephen was talking about, the incidents of these disruptions in the supply chain are going to happen. We cannot stop a volcano. We cannot stop a tsunami. We cannot stop the pandemic. We did as good a job as possible, I think. But let's really look into deeply how we rebound from those and what is the process within the supply chains that in this past pandemic sort of really proved to us that we didn't have a plan for this. So I'm going to talk about something that I'm sure Charles is real familiar with as well, and that is at the point where the pandemic did that very first lockdown, that very first freeze, we got to stop this thing from growing. What happened was all along the ports, and I'm going to use ports just as one picture inside the supply chain, but at the ports you had ships that were going to dock, but the dock workers said, hey, hold up, we're not going to gather together in gangs to unload because that could spread a potential of this particular virus. You had truckers who decided, no, we're not going to stop and pick up that can off that port terminal because of the freeze. You had railroads that slowed down dramatically. In air freight, you had passenger flights that literally overnight, international flights stopped overnight. It was ridiculously huge in the volume of air cargo capacity that got sucked out of the system. And your average $2.50 per kilo rate went to $12.75 a kilo because there just wasn't any lift. When the pandemic moved through and e-commerce grew and so many of the things that we were taking for granted, like just going to the grocery store and get toilet paper, for example, and we were scrambling to get things like that, and you know, because again, throughout the supply chain, the dock workers weren't there, the railroads didn't bring the trains, the trucks started slowing down because of people. People said, hold up, we're not going to go there. And as we thawed through this towards the end of last year, what happened in the e-commerce space is people still had to eat. People still had to have something to do around their homes. So you saw this huge growth in Home Depot, Lowe's, and Ace Hardware type people because everybody was at home fixing up the things that they were holding off on. You know, I looked at our family, Judge. We didn't go out to eat hardly at all during the first 6 months of the pandemic. We'd go to the grocery store, we'd make our own food, we'd make our own dinner, our own lunch. And so there was a lot of pent-up cash that the average American family had. They went to Home Depot, they spent it on things that they had put off. We're going to redo that deck. You know, it's time to put in the palapa. We're going to add to our patio outside. And so that caused a supply chain ramp up in certain areas where, here we go, you know, lumber prices today are $1,500 a 1,000 board feet. It was $335 when the pandemic started. So I think that it goes back to people, and the people finally, as we crossed through 2020 into 2021, the vaccine started taking a hold. In that fourth quarter of 2020, we got the vaccine. People started taking the vaccine. Thank God in March, I got my second vaccine. I'm real happy. I'm a protected elderly individual now. So that's good. That's a good thing. And we got to the point where the people started showing back up to work, and this congestion, I know Gene Soroka out at the Port of LA, and let me tell you, he's working overtime to get those ships in and processed, and to take care of what? Not only the normal flow of goods, but also the fact that we had this massive amount of extra cash in the system that needed to be spent, and people went out and spent it. I know that they did. Our family did. So I think we're seeing a resilience that took almost 12 months to get to, Judge. And I'm real interested to hear I'm really interested to hear from Stephen Flynn on how he is tracking this resilience and capability that we're going to put into the supply chain so that we can start making these things not 12 months resilience, but maybe 2 months. So thank you very much for having me. I'll turn it over to you, Judge.
Well, thank you, Curtis. I'm glad to know we all have some extra cash. I'm going to go home and ask about that, I think.
It's already been spent, Judge.
Oh, okay. Since you mentioned Steve Flynn, we're going to go back to him now, because he has this, once in a while, he just likes to scare people. And so he's got a presentation about supply chain resilience in a scenario. So Steve, can we go ahead and see that now?
That would be great. So if we can go ahead and get, there we are. So let me first set the context here of as we did at the outset, which is that the overall challenge here is we built systems for efficiency, for low cost. Goal was reliability. But often that ends up having built-in fragility if we haven't thought through, one, how somebody with malicious intent may want to exploit those systems or target them. And secondly, should that happen, what's the plan? And we just saw that play out with the Colonial Pipeline, of course. And the implications here are we're not just queuing up for gas stations. As this graphic characters, one of the issues is there are 5 military bases that are served and 10 additional ones from North Carolina, Maine that are served by the Colonial Pipeline. And so at some point in time, this starts to have national security implications, not just, that it makes our lives inconvenient or disrupted. But we've seen this movie before in a different variation, and that was with Superstorm Sandy that impacted on the Metro New York area. The Metro New York area typically uses 42 million gallons of petroleum products every day between aviation and diesel and gasoline and so forth. So what happened when Sandy hit is the port closed. That shut off 60% of supply. There were 2 main refineries in Port Elizabeth on the harbor, the Bayway and Hess refinery. They were shut down because of damage. The Philadelphia refinery was turned off just as a way to mitigate risk in advance. And the Colonial Pipeline was disrupted because they lost power in central Jersey, which shut down the compression station. And there's also damage up at the terminus in the Newark area. So the entire system failed. And you're suddenly short of 42 million gallons of gas. What have we done since that event to plan through getting better at that? Well, actually, the Bayway and Hessport Reading refinery are no more. And we got rid of them. The Philadelphia refinery is no more. We got rid of it. And so now the dependency on the pipeline has just gone up that much further, as well as the maritime side. So we're building in actually additional fragility and vulnerability because we're dependent increasingly on a system that brings on a day-to-day low cost and efficiency, but when disruption, things fail really badly. So this is a problem I've been worried about for a long time. And what really animated is this photo here captures this an aerial shot of Newark International Airport on the left, the Jersey Pike in the middle, There's actually the rail connection for railhead that brings most of the freight into the Northeast, running adjacent to the Pike. And then right next to that is Port Elizabeth, the largest container terminal on the East Coast. Brilliantly designed, basically a little over 1 mile. You've got all the means to move a box from a train to a truck to a train to a plane, all variations thereof. Nobody was thinking about, well, what happens if you actually disrupt this thing? What's the consequence going to be? We built it for efficiency and low cost, and we're potentially creating vulnerability. So with that sort of insight, I actually want to share a scenario that I testified to 15 years ago. And it's a scenario basically that begins with a shipment of sneakers being made in a factory in Surabaya, Indonesia. And how do those end up in the Foot Locker in Manhattan? Well, of course, it gets there via our wonderful global freight and supply system. So in this case, I have the system leave the factory. All is good. The orange truck goes. It's got a seal, but doesn't quite make it to the port directly. In fact, and the local Al Qaeda affiliate decides to take it into a dark alley. They take the hinges off the door to not mess with the seal. They take out some of the boxes and they put in a dirty bomb, basically explosives with radioactive junk, surrounded with a lead seal into the container. So where does it go? It goes to the port of Surabaya, and then ends up on a feeder that takes it to the port of Jakarta. And from Jakarta, it ends up going to the port of Singapore. And from Singapore, it ends up going to, on a ship like this, one of the mega ships that we saw stuck in the Suez Canal recently, and basically able to hold up to about 10,000 40-foot boxes. And then it lands in L.A. And from L.A., it's going to New York, so it gets there via rail. Then it gets on the Alameda Corridor with the double stack, then ends up in Port Elizabeth. And my scenario here is somebody decides to trigger the device that sets it off in Port Elizabeth. And then remember my picture. The disruption, particularly if the winds were coming from the southeast, is to put that radioactive junk across the rail, across the Jersey Pike, into the airport. Now, that would be a localized regional impact directly, right? Because we'd shut things down right away to deal with it. And it really is a Superfund problem. It's not like there's going to be massive death and mayhem by this scenario. But think through what has happened here relative to our current risk management regimes that we have in place. What basically we're relying on is, well, one, we've had this risk as well, which is the story of Port Tianjin in 2015, where hazmats took things off. But we're basically relying on this device for the system to make us safe. That is about a $2 seal. You can order them from Amazon if you want. A metal boat that basically locks the door. And as long as this metal boat, this container metal boat is intact, the number corresponds with the manifest, and originates from a trusted shipper, there's virtually no chance this container will get any care and inspection along its route. So under this scenario where this bomb went off in New York, the real major disruption is the entire global risk management system for the supply chain comes under scrutiny, and it doesn't hold up very well, because it turns out, of course, that the actual shipper was a member of CTPAT, the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism. The port of Surabaya was actually a Coast Guard approved under the International Port and Safety Standards. The ship itself was also ISPIS compliant. It landed in Singapore, which was ISPIS compliant. And there, in fact, there was a container security initiative, U.S. Customs Border Protection team available there to potentially target the container. But of course, this came from a trusted shipper, so it didn't check it. And it landed in L.A., and it went on a rail. And so do we know where the compromise happened? Was it at the initial point of origin, or was it somewhere en route? All that worry would lead to essentially a political response, which almost certainly would be like 9/11, or like we saw with COVID. Shut it all down till we can sort it out. But what does sorting out look like? 100% inspection? 100% inspection would itself, of course, put the entire system into gridlock, and that gives us with why we should be worried, is our most recent example of this without the security implications, was what happens when the Ever Given, grounded in the Suez Canal, is a system just in time increasingly concentrated around large ports and large distribution centers, is not really set up for disruption. The cascades can take weeks to sort out. All this is to say that when we think about the resilience imperative, it is recognizing that when we build hyper-connected systems, we have to think through the risk that we're generating and think through what the response should be. There are a number of solutions that can get us to a better place. Where the better place is not preventing every bad thing from happening. It is post something happening, ideally be surgical and understanding what went wrong, being localized in your response so you get the system back up and running as quickly as possible. That's what we call bouncing forward or becoming more resilient. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Steve. That I have to make a comment. Not long after 9/11, those of us who were in Washington at the time spent countless hours on Capitol Hill explaining to members of Congress why you could not inspect every container before it came into the United States. And so getting that message out to policymakers is sometimes difficult. And as you said, if we had to do that, that would shut down pretty much the whole supply chain. But anytime we deal with a disruption, I'll pull a question from the viewers. We've had a lot of disruptions lately. It may just be that we've experienced some main events. Colonial Pipeline was a cyber attack, and obviously it matters because it accounts for a sixth of all interstate petroleum product movement in the U.S. But there are workarounds. And to touch on one, and Charles, you may want to comment on this, or Curtis, the Jones Act presents a barrier to redundancy in the Colonial Pipeline case. And so that's just one example. How do we ensure resiliency across the entire delivery infrastructure, different modes perhaps, and maybe through expanding market access? So Charles, you or Curtis want to take off on that? And Steve, catch your breath and come back.
Let me yield to Curtis. Curtis, I'll yield to you.
Well, hey, thanks, Charles. I think that the decision that Biden took to put an exemption on the Jones Act was probably a day late and a dollar short, because within 24 hours, I think the Colonial Pipeline was back on grid. So I think decision making much quicker. And Steve, I'm sure that's part of your bounce ahead theory, is that we have to have these plans already in place. So you just pull up the playbook. Oh, Colonial's down. What's the playbook say? Exempt the Jones Act, and let's move forward with as many flag vessels as we can to shore up the petroleum products into the harbor ASAP, and not wait 5 days. I think it was 5 days before we actually flipped the Jones Act off. So I think much quicker decision making based on a plan that's already in place is really important. And I also wanted to go back just for a second on your presentation there, Steve. It's amazing that after 9/11, I was put on a subcommittee really quickly to present all the technology that was available to secure the supply chain. And as I made that presentation to then Commissioner Bonner of Customs, from that point on, I mean, this is, 2002, we've been looking for a methodology to track and trace and sniff those containers universally. That would be a requirement. And there never has been anything out there. There still isn't today. There's hope, and I'm going to talk about that at the end, but there still isn't anything today that will cheaply and with a 2+ year battery life give you the constant data directly to the shippers, the ports, the customs services, that allows you to know what's inside that box. Because I think, Steve, your number one thing after an event happens like this is, A, what else is out there? B, how fast can I get legitimate trade traveling? And it's not just because you're part of CTPAT. That's not the answer. It has to be much more defined, isolated, and then you let the rest of the freight flow and you know what's going on in the particular box or boxes that you've got questions about. So I want to yield back to you, Charles, for right now. But at the end, Judge, I like to talk about some new technology that has come out of the NASA science programs that I have just in the last 2 months been identified with, and this could be a future for us to have those answers.
Well, I don't feel qualified to speak to the Jones Act as a pure IT professional, but I will say that some of the things we're focused on at the port is being able to widen and deepen the channel so we can effectively increase our volumes. I talked about those 6 seconds per transaction. We're going to continue to be the busiest waterway and continue to provide billions of dollars towards the U.S. economy. But what keeps me up at night is this concept of, in the traditional and soon-to-be cyberspace concept called zero trust. And if you kind of apply that to the conversation you guys were just having, that means I don't trust you, assume an incident. And that is a hard scenario to deal with. We cannot continue to utilize traditional disaster recovery and business continuity concepts. We have to deal with serious scenario management and playbooks that says this is what we're going to do when we see this. And as it relates to my world and trying to protect the community and the business, we're taking this extremely seriously. I want to yield back, Judge.
Before we go to the questions, there are several comments about the Jones Act. I'm going to leave that for just a minute. Curtis, you had some technology you wanted to talk about?
Yes, sir, Judge. The 5 key elements of anything that works inside a container that have yet to be facilitated by any group and system of technology are the following. It has to be cheap. It has to be universally easy to install and re-battery. It has to have enough connectivity to allow any container, even if it's in the bottom of the stack, if it's an empty in the bottom of a stack, if it's on a train or a truck in China or a small truck in India, it has to be able to be locationally known, and it has to sniff intelligently. It can't, these radiation flow monitors we have now at these ports shoot the radiation into a container and it says you either have radiation or you don't. It doesn't tell you what kind of radiation, and 90% of the time it triggers off because it's some marble or granite that has a signature of the iridium that's in there that causes granite to have the nice, nice look on it, and it has nothing to do with security. So we have to be able to sniff better. And then the 5th thing is allowing that data to be used in all these. We have wonderful software that track and trace, trade management software, global trade management software. There's really good, robust systems. You can't pick up the Journal of Commerce, Judge, and not read 2 or 3 instances where venture capital has dumped $120 million into this guy and $2 billion into that guy for improvement in track and trace technology that's all human intervention added in terms of each movement. Someone has to do something. So that 5th element is that it must be completely passive. It's got to work off of systems that do not have anything to do with line of sight. And what I found working with some NASA engineers is I think they've come up with a solution. And hopefully on the next time we have this type of conference, Judge, we'll be able to talk about that. But I'm more excited than I have ever been in 20 years because I think that solution that I've been looking for, that Customs has been looking for, that Steve Flynn's been looking for, may finally exist.
Well, Judge, if I could maybe jump in and,
sure.
I think this has been one clearly of the important ingredients. As I've now spent my time in a major research university spent a lot of time with engineers and with network scientists and folks who are dealing with artificial intelligence and machine learning and the rest. This is a challenge of choreography more than it is of technology. The technology is there. We could embed technology into what is essentially a dumb system and allow us to monitor in near real time what moves through it, and then check it at ports periodically to see, if everything's still ticking. The data that this generates is substantial, but we have the tools to manage this kind of data. The means to make this fairly automated is there. There just hasn't been the political will and the coordination, because this would ultimately not have to be done as a U.S. requirement for U.S. ports, which would likely, one, to be suboptimal, put us at a competitive disadvantage, have to be advanced in the international scene, because the system is a global system. And it would have to be done with partnering with industry that actually owns and operates this system. There are technologies out there, interesting one coming out of our national labs as well, on scanning containers, muon tomography. The great value of this is it's a passive system that's a drive-through. And the key is you don't need to inspect as like our TSA looking at every piece of cargo. What you need to do is to validate a piece of hay is a piece of hay. And that is, in this world here, I can scan everything that comes through and just query, is there basically dense material that could shield a weapon? And there's very few containers that move that. And could I do I have radiation? And if it is it benign or is it something I should worry about?
Exactly.
That everything else gets cleared. And so that gets automated through the system. The advantage, though, of having the scan and capturing the image is if something goes wrong, you can replay the tape. You can go back and say, at this point, it was okay, but here was the problem, even if the system didn't catch it. So you're surgical. In my scenario with Surabaya, you would have identified in the port of Jakarta that you had a problem in Surabaya. Shutting down the port of Surabaya would not have global impact. Be bad for Surabaya, not for much for anybody else. So the key is you're thinking about technology embedded in the system, giving information to support what ifs that allows you to be much more nimble. And we just have to do this, but we're dealing with a system incredibly fragmented as a result. I can't resist the Jones Act here question as well, because yes, exactly. Of course, it has eliminated redundancy. And again, we've seen this movie before. In the case of Hurricane Superstorm Sandy in New York that I referenced earlier in my presentation, the bunch of ships went into Halifax when the port was closed, and others went down to Norfolk. The problem with the ones in Norfolk, they couldn't re-put them on a ship and bring them back to New York and New Jersey. They have to put them on train or truck, and there isn't a way to do that. In the case of Halifax, they were able to wait till the port opened and immediately put it on a vessel to bring it right into the port of New York, New Jersey. What is the lesson learned from the global container fleet? Don't use Norfolk. Go to Halifax. Now, if that's something that's helping the maritime industry, I'm trying to figure that out. So it's a combination of way in which I think we navigate this one, given the political size of it here. What we're looking for and should have been at the ready is just as Curtis laid out, is that when this thing happened with the Colonial Pipeline, where the government could step in, is providing immediate regulatory relief to essentially surge the system. Jones is one of those. Obviously, the rules related to hours that tank truck drivers can have with it crossing interstate boundaries, all these rules can be, which are fine on a blue sky day. They allow us to deal with other equities. But in a crisis where the lack of energy can be life or death, what we really want to do is remove those rules or in a manageable and hopefully thoughtful way. And Jones Act clearly has to be in the mix. You need to surge capacity if you lost capacity. So you want to draw on all you can.
Well, since we're going to talk about the Jones Act a minute, I have to weigh in because quite some years ago, I was asked to by the Maritime Administrator to do a survey of shippers as to why they don't use short sea shipping, or now we call it coastwise shipping. It's easier to pronounce than short sea shipping. And so I did the survey, and the survey came back from the shippers. We don't use it because the Jones Act makes it inefficient and more expensive. So I wrote up the results of the survey. I was told, well, we can't publish that. I said, but you asked me to survey the shippers to find out why they don't do it. Well, but we can't talk about the Jones Act. I don't know if that's changed politically in Washington. I doubt it. But if we're going to talk about security, the Jones Act, if we didn't have the Jones Act in its present form, would there be better quality shipping alternatives, coastwise shipping alternatives? I think so. Would shippers use that in exchange for taking some of the trucks off the highway? Probably. All those things, but maybe it's the security aspect that's finally going to turn the dial on the Jones Act to at least make Congress look at it. So anyway, okay, I'll get off my soapbox about the Jones Act. I've been doing that for a long, long time. I guess a question that you've touched on a little bit, but it was pointed out by one of the viewers in the audience. Most of the freight system is privately owned. So if we talk about security, resilience in the freight system, will that come in the form of a government mandate? How's that going to work? I'll throw that out to any of you. And then, Charles, I have a specific question for you in a minute.
So
hey,
I'll take that one on here. Oh, okay, go ahead, Curtis. You go first.
Just a quick note. The advantage, if someone can pull those 5 pieces together, the advantage would be that steamship carrier number 1 says, I'm going to offer this so that all my customers know exactly what's in there. Oh, and by the way, customs service, you can let all these things go because you are 100% inspecting them with a free feed of what's in it, what does it look like, is there any incidents, is there any sniffing, has anybody opened the box, because it will also take a picture. So that would be an advantage from a purely capitalistic perspective, and steamship company A may say, all right, do all my boxes. Mandating it through regulatory requirement is the much simpler and the much all-encompassing way, because to Steve's point, if the U.S. does it, everybody else is going to do it. And there really globally is about 5 to 7 major terminal operating companies that control 90% of all the containerized freight. So as soon as the U.S. would do that, I'm assuming that would be a quid pro quo on the regulatory front. Also, Steve, to your idea of the scanner, I've always thought, why don't you put the scanner right there on the couplers for the lift using the cranes? That touches every single box. You don't have to drive through. Just put the scanner right there on the lift mechanism for the boxes coming on and off the ship, and you've covered 100% of everything that moves.
Yeah, and some of that technology has been explored and is usable. And I think it really, if you get into the actual terminal operations, there just may be, in some cases, maybe for the gantry crane, because, you're primarily dealing with transshipment. In some cases, it may be gate entry makes sense because you have the space and it's primarily an exporting port. And that's where I think, so one is the standard should be performance-based. It's not a specific product with a specific thing. It's like, but I think we could set the requirement that before a box is brought into a terminal and is loaded on a ship, you should be able to confirm that it doesn't pose a risk. And there are a number of tools that can do that. There is a cost recovery mechanism already built into the ISPA's code, the International Port and Ship Facility Code. If it advances security, then the terminal operator can recover the cost of putting the security measure in place. Our estimate is that you could scan every container at about a cost of $10 a box globally, and you could throw away the technology every 2 years and come up with the next generation at that rate. And for those who are saying, and we went through some of this, Curtis and I were chatting earlier about how oh my God, the sky would fall in. We'll point to the freight rates right now. Into several $1,000s a box when, low points in 2008, you were shipping containers from China to the U.S. for $600 a box. The idea that somehow this is bringing gridlock by adding, especially if it's a uniform requirement. So bottom line, you have to partner with the infrastructure owner operators. You got to give them the means to recover the cost. It will get passed on. But the advantage of this is you are safeguarding the continuity of one of the most critical systems for the global economy. And the relatively modest investment, we make this all the time when we pay fees going into the airport, not applying to freight. It just makes no sense in my view, given that, we just keep having more scenarios, whether it's Colonial Pipeline or whether it's the Suez blockage. But when we bring those together, malicious intent tied to this system, anybody who's in this system who thinks it's, good to go from a security standpoint, is either brand new, came on yesterday, or is just wearing rose-colored glasses, because all of us know there, but for the grace of God, there is, there's chances for mischief. We just keep hoping for the best.
Charles, we've had a question. We've spent a lot of time this morning talking about evil acts by people, but Port Houston handles a lot of hazmat and petrochemicals, and I'm sure over the years the technology has changed in trying to prevent any kind of spills. What comments do you have in that regard?
Judge, when I first read the question in the Q&A, I was trying to figure out how to formulate an appropriate response for the group. I would respectfully ask that the producer put me in contact with this person, and I'll put them in contact with the appropriate one of my peers. I don't want to misspeak and be recorded forever, so I want to take the opportunity to have one of my colleagues who either does the actual operation and interaction with hazmat to address that specifically.
Okay.
But it is a true statement that Houston Port handles that very, very well. They're very well planned and very well knowledgeable in how to handle the hazmat.
And that's certainly been my experience there, because when it does happen, so there's sort of practice that happens here. But I think what there really has, one of the key points with the Port of Houston is the creating of essentially the common operating picture that allows the system to flex in ways that and deviate from kind of standard things here quite nimbly. And so I think that, the combination of, what the Port of Houston provides, what the Galveston, exchange, marine exchange capabilities, and the fact that mariners are able to work through with each other disruptive events because there's some familiarity with routines. This is really sort of key to success. The choreography, again, is often more of an issue of resilience, how we work and communicate and act and make decisions, than it is that there's a gee whiz tool or technology. A technology is an enabler, but if it's put in the system without thinking through how it can be usefully supporting operational issues on blue sky days as well as the gray and black ones, then you end up with suboptimal outcomes.
Okay. We spent a lot of time talking about resilience. This panel, though, is about resilience and efficiency. So, Curtis, get your thoughts together. We're living in a world. I teach a class here at Rice on transportation economics, and I make them read the box. The story about how containerization came about. But our basic container technology is pretty old. What's around the corner? What's going to make it more efficient? I know we've got bigger and bigger ships, and we've gotten much better at intermodal moves, but what else do you see coming that'll make the entire global supply chain more efficient?
Well, I'll tell you what the carriers say all the time, and that's better planning, better planning, better planning. If you, the BCO, the beneficial cargo owner, will tell us, the carriers, when you need the boxes, when you are going to, guarantee that we're going to have them during this time frame, then you're going to have a lot better response from the ocean carriers. But I think one of the things that the ports have been talking about for years, and that we really haven't seen, and goes back to the fact that it's a disparate supply chain. There are a lot of different players in the supply chain, and they don't necessarily have to work together, although they do all the time. But your biggest problem you're seeing with port overcrowding is not that the port's overcrowded, it's just they can't get the goods off the port. So it's a lot of off-port issues. We need a systematic methodology to allow for off-terminal truck holding areas so that I can have more throughput on terminal. You know, you get to a terminal, right, Charles? You can't just double the size of the terminal overnight because you got a bigger ship in there. It doesn't work that way. But the off-site parking for those trucks, still in a contained, very secure lot, we can do that in Houston because we got some land. It's very difficult to do that in LA Long Beach. And we need to have those capabilities. The East Coast railroads have really taken into heart the whole idea of short-haul intermodal. So in the East Coast, you've got intermodal terminals that are attached to ports that are 200 miles away. We've been working the Port of Houston's been working overtime trying to get a facility like that in Dallas, short-haul rail. Let's move it through Houston up to Dallas, through Houston up to maybe a Shreveport or a Kansas City or Memphis. And it just doesn't seem to play into what the ocean carriers and the railroads want to do. But that ability to get things off the terminal and moved into exterior but still controlled environments would make the freight system move twice as fast.
And Judge, I would jump in and say,
oh, please.
Charles.
I would jump in and say that, we spent a lot of time focusing on that same aspect of how quickly we can get a trucker or a transaction to take place. I mentioned the 6 seconds. The ability to have turn times be measured daily to get as many pieces of cargo on and off the individual terminals is really important. But the key there is reducing the amount of friction and making the movement as barrierless as possible, but also continue to do it safely and securely.
I want to echo that this is not this is not an inherent friction, and actually bring my security hat to this here. I have an axiom about security. Tough security is always simple, which is why it's bureaucratically and politically attractive, like building a wall. Right? You give me a 20-foot wall, I'll give you a 25-foot ladder. It's simple and almost always ineffectual. Smart security is always nuanced and almost always counterintuitive, which is why it really trips up bad people. And so you actually want to work to smart security. How does this apply to freight? Goods at rest are at risk. If you got something, a bottleneck, there is some bad guy who's figured out that's where it's sitting, and I get my arms on it. I get more security out of moving freight than I do by letting it be stuck in lots of waypoints. I mean, it made a great Hollywood Western to have those guys outlaws run alongside the train. Nobody does that. You wait for the train to stop. I mean, it's insane. So this real world is we want efficiency, and it does give us more here. But the key is you have to layer on that transparency, visibility, and accountability that what's moving through the system is legitimate, and the means to be surgical about how you deal with aberrations when they happen. The tools are there. That ultimately, the combination will make it a more resilient system. So if I purely put in place security measures that actually disrupt the system, that force informal workarounds, I've actually contributed to the security risk. The system is now more brittle. So we can get there, but we got to stop talking about this as efficiency versus. Ultimately, efficiency is a necessary market force, but in a way that achieves resilience and security, because that ultimately will allow the system to be durable in the face of disruption. And we know disruptions are going to be more frequent and more intense because we're hyper-connected.
Well, Steve, that's a great point to end on. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but the whole idea of efficiency and resilience go together, because if the freight is moving, the system's more resilient and it's more efficient at the same time. And that's what all of us in this line of work need to figure out how to do, is to keep it moving. thank all of you very much for participating. This has been enlightening. I know I appreciate it. The audience appreciates it. Coming up next will be, since we've talked a lot about infrastructure, Roger Gunther, the Executive Director of Port Houston, is going to be interviewing Congressman Brian Babin, who is on the U.S. House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee and represents Port Houston. So stay tuned for that. But thank you to all the panelists, and we'll see you for the next one.